Why is it so hard for white people to talk about racism? This illustrates a bracing call to white folk everywhere to see their whiteness for what it is and seize the opportunity to make things better. It is racist to generalize about people based on their race. With us today is Michelle Olivier, offers a unique perspective on career development and job searching with an impressive record of accomplishment on both sides of the desk. She combines over 20 years of experience in HR recruitment with certifications in career guidance and counseling, and she knows how to meet the needs of both applicants and organizations when it comes to matching talented people with top jobs. As a regular contributor to trusted sources for industry knowledge, including the New York Times, recruitment.com, and Refinery 29, Michelle is a dynamic thought leader and instrument of change in the talent acquisition field. Michelle has recruited at all levels from entry retail through executive with global expertise and a list of clients including Big Four, Big Tech, and F50, which is Fortune 50, right? Companies. Not only has she filled roles for household names like Microsoft, EA Games, Facebook, and the YMCA, she has worked individually with established professionals to land positions at places from Goldman Sachs to the American Red Cross. Michelle, thank you so much for coming today.
It is absolutely my pleasure, even though I have to say it's always makes me cringe a little. People read my biography. I'm like, oh, it's like I understand why we have to market ourselves, but it's just not, it's so not me. As you know, Rochelle, like I'm just not that like, oh, but yes, thank you, and thank you for having me.
I know it's hard to listen to the accolades when it comes from another person, I believe.
It is. And it's like, it feels like it just triggers all of those like imposter syndrome. Like, who is that girl? Ew, she thinks a lot of herself. It's kind of like, and I think that probably everybody feels that way at some level. But yes, anyway, thank you for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. The pleasure's all mine. So let's start with our thought provoking questions.
Excited.
If you can tell us, Michelle, how was it like being raised in your household?
From what perspective?
Well, what was it like growing up at home in the environment that you grew up in? Were you raised in a multicultural environment? Were you raised in a diverse environment? Was it, solely from, were your parents liberated? Were they conservative?
So my parents were both hippies. Start there. My mom is native, and my dad was white, Cajun to be specific. And I grew up much more in my dad's family than my mom's family. Um, and the fact that my mom was native was kind of always something that was there and something talked about, but was not an active part of our culture, if that makes sense, as a household.
She was Native
Um,
American.
yes, she's
Yes.
Comanche. Yeah. Um, and my in terms of the people that we interacted with, my parents were very much of that, like, I think especially 1980s mentality that was like, I don't see color. I don't see race. And like we were very much raised that way. They had friends of true diverse backgrounds. So like all colors of the spectrum, LGBTQ plus, all kinds of ages. Like I remember very clearly, my parents were in their 30s and 40s, and they had friends in their 60s. And when my parents were in their 50s and 60s, they had friends in their 30s and 40s. And so we were always raised around very, very diverse groups of people. My parents were very bad at remaining consistently employed. My dad was very convinced that he was the smartest man in any given room. And he often would tell people that. And after a certain point, as it turns out, people don't prefer to manage people who think that. Um, so we moved a lot. We financial security, housing security, food security, all of those things were not things that I really had as a kid. And so I think a lot of that kind of informed my perspective growing up. Like poverty was a very, very real part of my childhood and was a major source of embarrassment for me. Like, no kid wants to have friends come around and like, the food stamps are out and, or I went to a bougie magnet school and they did all like the bougie magnet school trips, which was great. But inevitably, like the teacher would be like, right, and just make sure that we have the check for $60 for the event. And then would look at me and be like, and if you need financial help, we can
Mm.
definitely make that happen. And I'm like, "Ugh, great, thanks. Why don't you sing out the one poor kid? All right, nice." So that's kind of maybe my parents were, my dad in particular was super competitive. Everything was a competition with my dad. Everything. Um, he did not believe in dabbling. He believed entirely that if you're going to do something, then you're either in or you're out. And so um, hobbies became dangerous as a kid because you couldn't indicate like a passing interest in a thing without then becoming your life. So I spent a lot of time growing up with various things that I was competing in. When I was younger, I was a competitive diver and swimmer, and then I was a softball person, and then later in life I was a competitive speech and debate person, and like all of those things were kind of flat out to the max. So I think that's probably the best description I can give of what my childhood. Does that answer the question about what my
Yes,
house was like?
it
Okay.
absolutely does. I think one thing that stood out was I don't see as your mom being Native American. You mentioned that it was not spoken about that she was Native American, that you didn't see color. What was that like for
It was
you?
it was very weird. It was so um for so my grandfather and grandmother on my mom's side, their parents had left the reservation together in the early 20th century, and because people were starving to death and there wasn't work and there wasn't food, and this little group of Comanches moved together and became migrant farm workers and picked cotton and worked in the fields across West Texas. And they were completely indigent. They, at that time, natives weren't able to purchase even cars, let alone homes, without a white person to sign with them. Um, and so they did their very best to whitewash the family. So they gave the kids names like Bill and Barbara and Ken and things that are like the whitest sounding name they could come up with. And um that and they completely like abandoned the native language. Only English was allowed to be spoken, and it was considered a point of shame, very deep point of shame, that they were native. And so my grandfather would get angry if it was brought up around him. Like he would be totally in denial. And I mean, like if you ever saw a picture of my grandfather, there would not be any doubt. Like he looks like every old Native American dude in every picture book ever, right? Like exactly like that. And like he doesn't have long hair with feathers in it or braids, but otherwise, like I mean, it could not be more obvious. And that's true for like most of my mom's family. And they were so excited that like my mom is blonde with blue eyes. And so she looks a lot less native than all of the rest of them. And so that was a source of pride for my grandfather, which is a weird thing for me, that to have that like, oh good, she doesn't look like who we are. And then it was very much like, okay, that family is going to be okay. They're not part of this. And so because of that, like my mom wasn't raised hearing about the culture, hearing anything about any of that. And then if I, as a kid, tried to reach out and ask questions, my grandfather was very much like, we don't talk about that. Like, it was the first Bruno of my life, right? Like, we don't talk about being Native. We don't talk about any of that. My mom was perfectly happy to have the conversation, but she didn't have a strong knowledge base. So she didn't know much more than she had learned in, public school education about life for Comanches, other than she knew the lived experience of her parents and her grandparents, and all of that was, the lived experience of soul crushing poverty and migrant farm workers. So, like, and when I say that, like, for some context, the first time my grandparents ever lived in a home that had anything other than dirt for a floor was when they lived in the married housing for the barracks when my grandfather joined the army. And the first pair of shoes that my grandfather ever owned that were originally his shoes were his army boots. And the first time my grandmother ever had a dress that was her dress, like, purchased for her, was her wedding dress.
Right.
And so, like, those are things that now today, like, you can't even imagine, right? That sort of life. But that was very normal for
Right.
them at the time. And so those are the things that she knew. Those are the things that she grew up with. But and all of that is certainly adjacent to the culture, but not a part of it as such.
Right. It's interesting how you're on the show today to talk about white fragility, and here your mom is, or you are as well, Native American, and having seen firsthand what really happens to Indigenous people, to Blacks like myself, to Browns, Black and Brown people, women and men of color. Does it offend you when, or if someone would tell you that you have white privilege, and how is it that you've been able to assimilate your upbringing and the lived experiences from your mom and not being able to talk about her background and her culture to today?
It does not offend me. I think that it would be pretty asinine for me to say that when you and I walk down the street, we have the same experience. I have fabulous cheekbones because I'm Native, and some other, like, great features from that. But my skin tone is pale. And so when I walk down the street, I get treated like a white person. And that is a different experience than for people who have beautiful, glorious melanin in their skin. And to try to pretend otherwise is just ridiculous. So, absolutely, absolutely, I have white privilege, 1,000%. And no, it would never offend me to say that. Does that mean that I didn't come from poverty? No, it does not. Does that mean that I have never had a challenge in my life? Obviously not. And I think that that for me is what white fragility is about, is people who conflate those two things. That they think that just because they have had and dealt with adversity, that means that they don't have privilege, and that's just simply not true. So I think that all of that is the case. I do think that one of the things that is difficult for all of us, from all different backgrounds, as we're navigating these waters of starting to have these dialogues in common spaces and starting to move the needle in professional contexts, is about how do we give everybody a seat at the table, and what is everybody's place at that table. Because you're right, like, I have a lived experience and I have a perspective as somebody who is Native. And certainly, like, I see my history and my culture being appropriated, and I see the ongoing colonization of, like, my people and all of that. And, like, that is a very real experience, and it definitely deserves a place and a moment of conversation. But it does not give me the right to comment on the issues that face Black women in this country or anywhere else, right? Because they're not the same. And so I would say that for me, what I personally struggle with is that I white pass, right? So where do I get to have a voice? And the same is true, I'm queer, but I'm married to a cis hetero dude. So again, I straight pass. And so in all of these different places in my life, I have so much privilege from that it's difficult to know kind of where is an appropriate moment for me to chime in, because I never want to forget that. But also, I think it's important to know that. I think especially for natives, we often white pass. Like, people have in their head this mental image of what a Native American looks like, and they think that it has, they have long black hair and braids, and many of them do, and that's fantastic. But sometimes we have short purple hair and no braids, and like, people make assumptions about darkness of skin, which is not necessarily true, or color of eyes. And so there's a lot of one of the things that we hear a lot is, "Oh yeah, you're Native." Like, everybody has a great great uncle who was Cherokee one time. For some reason, always the Cherokees they pick on. But like, and it's very dismissive of the experience. And so I think that those are probably the areas that I struggle with in terms of having the discussion.
It's interesting you said that. I mean, this conversation is going in places where I wasn't expecting, but
Sorry.
no, I'm happy because it's actually brings up a lot of other questions aside from the ones I shared with you. However, the point you made about, you said you understand what white privilege is, and I think your aunts and uncles, I think you mentioned, had very white names. As a recruiter, how do you filter all that?
So, as the recruiter, what I would say is I'm one of the things that I, as a person, struggle with is I was raised with this whole, "I don't see race. We don't see race." And I get very frustrated that I feel like we've moved the conversation past that in some ways. To
Right.
like, you have to see race. Come on, don't, that's an asinine thing to say. Of course you see race. But then for some reason in recruitment at the moment, it the in vogue thing to do is to literally say, "I don't see race," because we removed names. So if we take away the names on the resume, if we take away the names of the institutions where they were educated, etc., that if we make ourselves race blind, that somehow that fixes the problem. And makes me really angry, because I feel like it's the exact same thing that we've already said is not right. We can't stop seeing race. It's not a thing. If you look at anybody's resume, all you're looking at in that is the track record of how well they have been rewarded by a bad system. We know that institutional racism is a thing. We know that people of minority backgrounds have a different access to opportunity. And so to try to say that if
Because
I
they're
just
profiling.
yeah, so to just say, if we just take the names off, now it equalizes, I call bullshit. That's just not true. We
Right.
know that, like, we're still seeing the result of that institutionalized racism, regardless of what we name it. And I think the same is true when we have, like, taking candidates' names off of a resume. That is basically saying, I mean, that's like the written equivalent of saying, right, well, we're going to blindfold you so you can't see their race. Oh, come on. Come on. This is ridiculous. The truth of the matter is that we need to be working with organizations to be proactive about balancing the the pool. So, do I absolutely notice the race of applicants when I engage with them, when I, meet with them, what have you? Of course I do, because I'm not blind. Does that in any way impact my thinking? Yes, it does. because I think it is exciting to have a new voice at a table. And so when I have clients who have overwhelmingly white dudes and I get to present them with a woman of color as an option, I am excited about that because they need that different voice on their team. And no, I'm not shy about saying that. And I think to say otherwise is lying to ourselves.
Right. So the idea that, you see, it's interesting. Dr. I don't know if you read this, but White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for
Mhm.
White People to Talk About Racism by Dr. Robin DiAngelo. She said she calls it nice racism.
Yep.
So yeah, nice racism would be, I'm not racist. I have a biracial son.
Mhm.
Or I'm not racist. It's a personal attack.
Mhm.
So I'm not racist. I have a black son-in-law.
I can't be racist. My mom's Comanche. Of course I'm racist. Of course I am. I grew up in the United States. You can't grow up in the United States and not have been programmed to hold negative racial stereotypes against some groups. Absolutely. And so being anti-racist means that I acknowledge that and I work every single day against those things that I was programmed with. And I work really doubly hard to make sure that I raise my kids with different programming than what I got. And that, I mean, to me, like, otherwise, and I agree, like, obviously, I agree with what she says that there is, we've created so much stigma around this word racist that people are terrified to have that label applied to them, and they feel like racist equals evil, and it's just not true. Like, if you are leaning into your racism, I mean, you can make a pretty good case, right? But the fact that you have those beliefs, that you have those implicit bias or whatever you want to call it programmed into your brain, that doesn't make you evil. It just makes you the product of this culture, which is a culture of institutionalized racism and colonization. The fact that, we still have people who argue that it is ridiculous that why can't Native Americans be our mascots? Like, what's wrong with the tomahawk chop? We've been doing it for over 50 years. It must be right. No. The fact that you've been racist for a really long time doesn't make it okay to keep being racist. Like,
Right.
and so, we have, those are the things that are the problem. The fact that you've come out of growing up in this society with really bad things that you've been taught and you have to work against them, that doesn't make you evil. It just gives you, that's just part of your challenge in terms of being a better person and breaking the cycle of racism. In this, we would say the same thing about like cycles of abuse, right? Like, as a kid, you grow up seeing that, my parents were very they were corporal punishment. There was a lot of yelling in my household. Do I know that yelling at children is not a great parenting model? Yes, I do. Do I still accidentally yell at my kids? Yes, I do. Because it's a cycle that we have all been initiated. And so I have to work really hard to break the cycle. It's the exact same thing with racism.
Right. Do you think, do you believe that it's up to white people to be able to start the conversation and to own up to their prejudices to be able to stop the cycle, like you said?
Absolutely. And I think more importantly, it's up to white people to have a conversation with other white people. You need to leave some black people alone for a damn minute. Like, there's been enough burden in that direction. Like, black people are not the problem. Brown people are not the problem. White people and white passing people. So I'm putting myself in that camp, right? We are the problem. And so we need to have those conversations between ourselves with the tools and resources that are out there, like my friend Madison Butler says all the time, Google is free. Like, go forth, y'all, and Google. Like, it's up to us. The books have been written, the tools are there, the resources are there. Asking your Black and brown friends to educate you at this point is just being lazy and is a continued part of the problem. So, yes, it is our job. It is our job to have the conversations between ourselves every day and to call each other out on
Right.
every single part of it.
Right. Will Bauman is hi Will, thank you so much for joining us. He says I think we need to challenge anyone in any moment who otherwise doesn't see their own prejudices.
I think that's fair.
Right. And it's and not to see it as a personal attack,
That's right.
because like you said, I have unconscious biases as well, and judgments, and because of my preconditioning upbringing at home. I mean, it's just something that I have to admit, it's something that I was raised in and born with as well. And like you said, it's a constant effort on my part to rewire and remap my brain
Absolutely.
to remove those barriers so that we can, work towards a non-racist climate. But it's going to take a very long time, because people need to admit first that that's what it is. It takes a lot of emotional intelligence to be able to step back and reflect and say, this is how I am.
What
And
I
this,
find,
mhm,
yeah, what I find fascinating though is that we are very comfortable having this dialogue in the space of gender, right? So
right,
we're very comfortable having this dialogue around the fact that we have taught men that domestic duties are women's work. And even in enlightened households, right? I definitely put myself in the feminist camp, and my husband would tell you that that is definitely the camp in which I live. And yet, in my household, 75 to 80% of domestic duties right here, because I have been taught that that's a woman's role. And I know it and he knows it, and we actively fight against it. Now, he's also very bad at some of that, because part of the problem is we don't teach boys how to do their own domestic work. We don't teach them how to cook. We don't teach them how to do laundry. So part of it is that now I have, like, this 40-something-year-old guy that I have to teach how to do the basics in my mind that I've been doing since I was 7, because we definitely teach girls how to do it. And we're all very comfortable, for the most part, having that conversation. Nobody thinks that makes anybody evil. We all admit that that's a problem and it's somewhere that we need to change things. And I don't understand why we can be so comfortable acknowledging that disparity, acknowledging that we have an institutionalized system that fed us all the same line that we're now all having to work together to overcome. And then the same exact thing, but in a slightly different space, and people freak out and become so completely defensive and unable to engage. And like, the hateful commentary that I see thrown at people who have the temerity to say this
right,
is just unbelievable. Unbelievable. I made a very innocent post the other day about implicit bias. It was not groundbreaking nor profound. It was just, hey man, you have some, you should check it. And I got the typical white dude response of, well, statistically, blah, 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 blah. I'm like,
mm,
friend, everything you just did there makes you in the problem camp.
right,
And other people are like, well, those are all just your opinion, and you're just trying to push them on other people and call that a bias. No, no. One of the examples I gave was, if you hear a news report that says a criminal did some criminal act and your immediate mental image is that the person was Black,
right,
that's implicit bias. Every time.
Right.
And the person was like, well, the majority of violent crimes in this country are committed by Black people, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, statistically, that's not true.
Right.
The ones that get prosecuted, the people that like, right? So let's talk about the problems with our criminal justice system. But B, it's still a bias that you're assuming. Wherever that bias comes from,
Right.
your perception of reality is what always creates your bias, right? But then the bias feeds reality, and that's the point in
Right.
calling it out. So, yeah, I don't understand what it is that makes race in particular something that people just can't talk about and can't own it in the same way they can with other areas.
Right. It's interesting. Claude Johnson says something here. Thank you, Claude, for joining in. He says, just realized too that the label of racist was socialized into an unthinkable taboo precisely because that made it possible to separate those bad racists from everyone else, which had the effect of stopping any conversation about racism. Many households under the umbrella. Oh, under the umbrella of, meaning that's not us.
Mhm.
So they separated it. So it's exactly what she says right here. You know, there's a quote that says, um, oh, it's focusing on race that divides us. So it's a division.
Mhm.
You know, that's you and that's me. This is how I live and this is how you live. And this is you on the socioeconomic level and this is me on the socioeconomic level. Oh, this is where I graduated. Well, this is where you see how the division happens when
Absolutely.
there's a separation in the language.
Absolutely. Well, and it's like so there's one of the things that I find very interesting that I've had this discussion somewhat heated with some of my business partners is around the whole girl boss or
Mhm.
woman entrepreneur or Native American entrepreneur or queer entrepreneur or any of the other titles that I can have. And
Right.
I find it so this is one of the areas of gray that I find interesting is because we have this dilemma that we know representation matters, right?
Right.
We know that little girls need to see women scientists to know it's okay for girls to become scientists. We know that the only with very few exceptions that the examples of black people in television and in pop culture are athletes and musicians. And so those are the only two paths that we teach black children that they have options moving up into. We know those things need to change, right? We know the importance of the Obamas to the community, right? We get that. And at the same time, calling somebody out as a woman entrepreneur as opposed to just an entrepreneur
Right.
or a black president as opposed to the president.
Right. You know, it's
I
interesting.
haven't decided where I fall. So I'm
That's interesting you said that. I think what happens is we're Haitian. I'm Haitian. And my parents grew up in a black nation. And when they moved, there were black presidents. I mean, we're not going to talk about the politics, but there were, black presidents, black vice presidents. It was normal, so they didn't have to say black.
Mhm.
Moving to the U.S. in the '60s, very tumultuous. In Boston, went to an Ivy League school. They were a handful of Haitians going to Northeastern at the time. You know, KKK was huge. Um, their cars got burned. Professors professed that they would fail my parents. They were both on scholarships. I mean, the stories are endless. However, I think because when you're brought up in a nation where all of it is normal, and in America, what has taught to be normal, like you mentioned, was the basketball player and the musician or rapper. The Black president, for me, is a huge thing since it's a role model for my daughter. Or actually, she wasn't even born at the time. She's only 7, but it could still be a role model for my daughter because all the other role models were not. So that's from my perspective. And I think it's really important to start. The other day, exactly what Madison said, I Google searched one of the first astronauts to travel to space, and he was Black. But it was on page 255 in Google. If I type yoga on YouTube, I need to be specific now and type Black women yoga so I can have my daughter see that there are other people outside of white people who are doing yoga. Or so it's so filtered in very many ways that saying the Black president is, oh my gosh, my Black brothers, there's hope for you.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? There's your role model. This is
Yeah.
a role model for you.
But at the same time, I also feel the whole idea that it feeds the I don't know where the line is, honestly, Rochelle, because like I also hear the argument that it feeds into the implicit bias. Like, at what point do women in business become just business people?
Right.
And at what point I absolutely call myself a girl boss. I absolutely call myself a female entrepreneur because I don't see enough women in business. And my
Right.
argument is that when we are 60% of the boardroom, like we are 60% of this population, and when we close the pay gap, then I will take the title off because of exactly what you're saying. But for others, I have heard the argument that it diminishes it. And I'm like, oh, if we're still saying that being a female entrepreneur is diminished, then I definitely need to stand up and be a female entrepreneur.
Correct.
But also, I think that there's at what point do we just say that I don't need a separate label? I am just an entrepreneur. And I don't know where that line is. I hope that I feel sooner than later that there is enough representation that it's not worthwhile adding the moniker. But for right now, I think that the representation part, like you're saying, is much more important. That if when we get to a place where you Google yoga instructor and it's like even split between all of the different
Yeah.
races,
Right.
great, then we don't need to Google Black yoga instructor. But until that day, it's important.
Right. There's someone, a LinkedIn user, who said we can turn white guilt into white responsibility. Any ideas how to reframe this talking point?
Around white guilt, I think that the problem with white guilt is that people guilt is a negative and nasty thing to carry around.
Right.
And so people often, when they feel guilty, it makes them feel trapped. It makes them feel like they've done something wrong, which in turn leads to defensiveness and in turn leads to hostility. So that's when you push on that button, you get the no, 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 no. I'm not racist. I'm one of the good guys. I'm an ally, right? That's where that comes from. So I think that what we need to do is remove the need for guilt. The only thing you need to be guilty of is the choices you make. If you choose to be a racist, if you choose to lean into the programming that you've been given, then you should really evaluate your choices.
Right.
And if you don't choose that, I didn't choose to be programmed to be racist. I didn't choose to be programmed that my job in life is domestic servitude, right? Like, I didn't choose those things. I choose what I do with that. I choose how I engage with the hand that I've been dealt. And so I think that that's the reframing that that we've seen people trying to make with the dialogue, right? That it's we're talking about racism. We're moving the needle to being anti-racist. It's not that I'm not a racist, it's that I am actively anti-racist. I am actively doing things to correct the programming that I acknowledge that I have and actively trying to correct the problems that I see in the culture around me. And I think that's really what we have to focus on. That as long as we focus on this idea of guilt and we allow the guilt to continue to be there, that guilt is, like I said, it festers and it breeds this defensiveness, which breeds hostility. And then that's when we get the, well, it's not my fault. That's where we get this whole, well, it's not that it's an implicit bias. It's because statistically, Black people make all of the crimes, right? That's what comes from that. So
Right.
we have to take that out and then move the dialogue to being, okay, look, now what? This is
Right.
where we are.
Right.
Now what?
Right. Malika Simmons. Hi, Malika. Thanks for always chiming in. She says, if we focus on letting people identify as they are comfortable and in ways that personally empower them, that's a start.
I would agree. I think some of my concerns around that is that we have it. I think that it is important to remember that there is a different experience that some people have by things that is not about a chosen identity,
Mm.
that is about an identity that they didn't get to pick.
Mm.
Um, you did not get
Whoop,
to
you
choose
just
to.
made me choke.
You know, we one of the things, I have a good friend, and I'm a bit of a smart ass, and my kids are taking after their mom, and we were talking about teasing, and one of my friends was
Oh.
saying that what she has taught her kids, and I think this is so great, it is fine to tease somebody about anything they chose.
What do you mean?
It's anything that they choose, it's okay to be funny, right? So, oh, he chose a banana over an orange. Ha
Ah,
ha, bananas are funny. It is
ah.
not funny ever to tease somebody about something they didn't choose.
Hmm.
So, his legs don't work the way that mine do. He didn't choose that. So we don't make fun of that. That's never funny to make fun of. He looks different
Hmm.
than me. He didn't choose that. We don't make
Hmm.
fun of him about that. And
Right.
I think that that's kind of a good rule for a lot of things, right? Like, we have to acknowledge that, yes, there are things that we can choose, there are things that we can pick to identify with, but we also have to acknowledge that a bunch of other people have things in their life that they never chose, that dramatically change their world experience.
And their lived experiences.
That's right. That's right. It dramatically changes the way that everybody engages with them, and it was not a thing they ever picked. And that deserves a different discussion and a different voice. And
Right.
it's not fair. We've had a couple of examples of people claiming a Black identity that were not, right? There was the
Mm.
professor and a bunch of other, and you just think, what? Like, they're trying to, co-opt that experience for the people,
Mm.
and their response was exactly as, well, but I identify. This is not a thing you identify as.
Right.
This is a thing that you don't get to choose.
Right. Do you understand what Black Lives Matter really means to the community? I love your mask. It says Black Lives Matter, and
Absolutely.
I'm sorry.
I said absolutely. Yeah.
Oh yeah, and Black Lives Matter for you is not. Actually, I'm going to let you answer that. I was going to dive a little bit deep, but what does it mean to you? I remember at one point, to put everything in perspective, Everybody on Instagram was putting the black square. And I personally didn't. I'm not someone who's a follower, and I don't believe we're a trend and that it's a moment or a phase. So, how do you understand what Black Lives really means to the community?
I think it would be ridiculous for me to say that I did
That you
entirely.
did or didn't?
That I do entirely.
Right.
I don't live that life, right? So
Right.
one of my good friends and I were talking, and she's a former deputy mayor for Washington D.C. and affluent, brilliant woman, well educated, lives in the bougie part of DC, um, and her kid was late walking home from school, and there were cop cars, and she was terrified.
Mm.
And no, no, I cannot identify with that terror as a mom. And to try to say that I can diminishes that experience.
Right.
No, my little, pale skinned, blue eyed babies are going to absolutely look like every part of the patriarchy walking down the street, right? Even my oldest with his sparkly leggings and, other things that he's going to have a hard time with, but that experience that she would be terrified that somebody, and rightfully so, that something would have happened to her baby just because he was a Black boy on the street, that I absolutely will never understand. I can try to empathize. I can hear, I can absolutely, as a mother, I can get a sense, but I will never really know what it is to walk that path. And to try to say that I do is so grossly disrespectful that I could never do that.
Right.
The reason that I wear the Black Lives Matter mask in my picture, the reason that I think that that's important is because I want the minorities that I work with to know that this is a safe space and that I see you and that I value you. And it's an easy way to do that. And I also want the people that are not cool with that to just take their business somewhere else.
Mm.
I don't work with jerks. I say that all the time. So if your organization is not delighted to have a recruiter who engages with the entire candidate pool world with a Black Lives Matter mask, then I'm not the girl you're looking for. And I don't want to be.
Right.
I get people who are like, it's so unprofessional for you to lead with your politics. I was like, sure. And if that's how you feel, you should not give me your business. Great. I think that it is absolutely my job to lead with that because I will tell you immediately, I would never put a candidate into a role that I felt like they would be unsafe.
Mm.
And I don't just mean physically, I
Hmm.
mean from an overall treatment perspective. And so any organization, any hiring manager who has a problem with somebody wearing a Black Lives Matter mask, I would not feel safe putting a minority candidate in there, and I absolutely go out of my way to try to support and put forward minority candidates, so I'm out.
Right. And it's so I'm not sure what the correct word would be. I am thinking solidarity, or um it's more of a boundary, and you're vocal about it. I think that's what's imperative in this conversation, is that you're vocal about it, and it's not something you're hiding from. Do you think
Nope.
that's because of your lived experience with your mom?
I think it's because of a lot of things, I grew up in Texas, like, surrounded by racist assholes, and so when you grow up in that, and I think that and you watch it happening around you, you can either choose to get angry and determined to fix it, or you can sit down and be part of the problem. I'm a big believer that, if 4 people sit down to dinner and 3 of them are Nazis, 4 Nazis sat down to dinner. Um, that, if you, I'm just, I call a duck every single time, every single time. And I think that it is absolutely my job with the skin tone that I have to stand up for the people who don't get to have a voice in the room.
Right.
And I think that it's such a small thing to have the mask on my picture, but it manages to achieve a bunch of things all at the same time. And I just think that, um, my worry is always I don't want people to think it's performative, but I also think that 2 seconds looking at my content and you would be disavowed of that concern since I talk about it kind of a lot. But yeah, I think that I am honestly, I would love to see more people doing that. I worry so deeply that Black Lives Matter is a fad in the same way that, hashtag me too was like very in the moment, and now it's like, oh my God, that was so 2 years ago, right? Like I we haven't fixed it. Like just because a couple of murderers went to jail does not mean that like we fixed the problem. And so until the problem is fixed, it's not a fad. It's not so however long ago. And I am terrified that the social consciousness is going to move on to a different topic,
Hashtag.
a new hashtag, and it's going to go back to being exactly the same, and it's going to go back to stop getting the press, and we're not actually going to make the change that is so desperately needed.
Do you think the change needs to be legislative?
Of course, part of it does. So much of it has to be, right? Because
Because
people, I
we
mean,
we, we talked
tr-
about institutionalized
yeah, and so we need to
racism
have
and
institutionalized anti-racism, right? We've had
right,
institutional racism for how many hundreds of years? The only way to fix it is with institutionalized anti-racism, and that looks like all kinds of things.
right,
And absolutely, absolutely, and it needs to be part of the answer. Yeah, and
right,
until it is, nothing is actually going to change. The statistics out there about the the what happens to even minorities working in police forces, that it's within 6 months they have the same black cops have the same response to a black suspect that a white cop would. Within 6 months, their empathy is eroded and the acculturation into that toxic environment is that comprehensive. Like that is terrifying as a
that's the
number.
Stockholm syndrome.
And I and that tells me that there is something more profound than we're going to fix with, a well-intentioned training seminar.
Right. And Patrick Carmichael says something here. He said, just considering, thank you, Patrick, for popping in. He said, just considering why it's so much easier to accept that there are issues with gender roles, which is what we were discussing in the home, than it is to accept that we have issues with racism. It's not as embarrassing to admit that we have been trained to do or behave a certain way based on gender. This coming from a very domesticated man who was raised by women to do all things. As a person who desires to be thoughtful and responsive to social justice, it's very embarrassing to recognize I've been so naive about this.
I think that, yeah, I mean, it is. It's embarrassing to me. I look back and I think about, the things that I was brought up to think and say that like, oh, I don't see race. Everybody might as well be green to me because they're all the same. Like those are things that I were taught that were good things to
Right,
say.
right,
And that's now looking back, I'm just kind of horrified. Like, of
right,
course there are differences.
right.
Sorry.
It's okay. Are you okay?
Yes, just like I said, under the weather today.
I know.
But yes, I'm back. So
Mm,
yeah, I think I just don't understand why we experience more shame around one set of bad behaviors
right.
than we do around another.
Right.
And I genuinely like I don't understand where that comes from. Like why I think about the things that people said and think and all of that around issues of sexuality or issues of gender, around all of those things. And I consistently, it's the race issue that is where people have this like hard wall.
Right.
And it's just, I think that I, I don't under, I think it's mystifying personally.
That is. He says, Deshawn Rose. He said it's a sensitive but needed topic to say someone can't choose a racial identity, but society is so accepting about gender orientation. There's a contradiction there that needs to be addressed. Jacqueline, she says, love your answer. Almost brought me to tears in response to the Black Lives Matter. Jean Lude, who was also on my show, he says, I really appreciate the honesty of your answer about Black Lives Matter. Patrick Mitchell, I follow the San Diego Reddit thread just so I never forget about how many racists call California home. You could be such an agent for change, and it's really nice to encounter you. Yeah. How do you give others the confidence to speak up? Asking for a lot of friends. Yeah. Malika Simmons, she says, I don't believe just the factor of choice indicates a protected status. It presupposes that I can't and would not have chosen a thing. There is nothing wrong with my blackness, whether I choose it or not. I don't need protection. Black is not a pathology. I feel the same about I don't see color as it assumes I get a pass for my color. If you don't see it, you are saying that you forgive me for it and I'm just like you. Hard pass. If you don't see color, then you don't truly see me.
I totally agree. I
Right?
totally agree. And
Right?
I think it's one of those things that, I'm a Gen Xer, and I think that I'm either a Gen X or a geriatric millennial, depending on where you call the split. Neither one of them is particularly, I think, great. But we think of my generation as much more forward thinking and inclusive, and we tend to think, oh yeah, these are a lot of these things are generational problems and very much of the boomer mentality. But I think that what Malika was saying is absolutely true. Like my generation was raised with this like I don't see color, and I she's exactly right. Like that if I say that I don't see color, then I don't see you. And I don't see that you have a different experience than me, and I'm not embracing that
Right.
in the same way. And I have, friends in my life. I'm fortunate enough that I forget that we have a different experience. And so I'll say things like, "Hey, let's go get food at such and so." My friends will be like, that seems like a terrible idea." And I was like, "Why, they have really good barbecue." And they're like, "I don't know if you noticed, but I'm black and that's a small Texas town and maybe you go get the barbecue and bring it back here." And I'm like, "Oh, yeah, that's fair." And it just, things that my skin tone privilege just does not even put on my radar. And if you don't have a network of people who call you on that and help show that mirror to you so that you can see, you absolutely like you lose sight of it. And it's really easy to be in this cocoon of, I am so much better than the generations that came before me. I mean, that's the low bar, right? Like, not, you don't get a gold star for not using the N word, right? You,
Right.
there's a lot more
Right.
than that to the whole thing.
Right. Do you think that white fragility is how people perpetuate racism by being too fragile to
Yeah,
openly
absolutely.
and honestly discuss the subject?
Absolutely. Your fragility is what keeps you from moving forward. As soon
Right.
as you get into that defensive place, as soon as you're of that mindset that, we can't talk about that, etc., then you've already lost.
Right.
And you have to, one of the things that I always that I think a lot and say a lot is that, especially things like implicit bias, even people who acknowledge it, they think of it as a problem of the collective, never a problem of the individual.
Right.
So, like, when I work with hiring managers, like, "Oh, yes, implicit bias is a thing. We really should educate, the team." I'm like, "I'm gonna start with you because you have it." And they're always like, "Well, but," sputter. No, stop. We all have it. And it's so easy. We get into these habits of passing even people who are, quote, enlightened or allies, right? It becomes like, "Oh, but because I know that's a thing, then I don't have more work to do." Incorrect.
Right.
Because you know that's a thing, that's how you know you have a lot of work to do.
Right.
And when you stop knowing that, then you stop being an ally and you start becoming part of the problem.
Right. What would you say? I know we've passed our time. We're going to close soon, but what would you say to anyone who said, I don't understand how my whiteness has shaped me? What would you tell them?
I don't even know where to start with that, Rochelle.
Mm,
I think that if you don't understand, then you need a bigger and more diverse set of friends. Because I think
mm,
that if you don't understand that your whiteness is a different experience, if you don't understand that that changes fundamentally the way that the American culture treats you, and then that's because you are only surrounded by other people who get treated the same way. And so
right.
you live in an echo chamber of whiteness.
Right.
And so it is your job to go get educated, to go out there and put yourself in a position to see the reality for other people. Now, I'm not saying go up to the first brown person you say and say, "Hey, I'm looking for a brown friend. Do you in?" Because that's also asinine, right? But like I am saying, put yourself in a position to see what they see, to experience what they experience.
Empathy.
Go get educated. If you are seeing that it does not in somehow color your experience of the world, then you live in a massive echo chamber and it is on you to fix it and nobody else can do it. Because I would never sign up a brown person to go straight into that echo chamber and be the token, right? Like
Right.
that's not nobody wants that job. So by all means, it's on you to go out and get the information and to fix it.
Right. Many liberal people probably listening to this will be mortified to think that they're the problem. How do you think they should stop it?
Well, start by opening your mouth more. So if
Calling it
you
out.
calling it out, absolutely. There's a thousand things you can do. I do things like, again, I live in Texas. If I see a person of color has been pulled over, I stop. I get my privileged ass out of my bougie SUV, walk over with my camera and say, "Is everything okay here?" Not talking to the officer. "Can I
Right.
help you, friends?" And I offer my privilege in a way like that. If I'm in a boardroom, I speak out. Hey, I call out just today. I had a meeting with one of my clients where I was like, I'm just going to say, we have a diverse candidate here. And our process does not celebrate diverse people because of this, 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 and this. So before you reject this person for not wowing you, go check yourself. Make sure that's what you want to do. And when we have the call next month about why your diversity numbers aren't where HR said they should be, I'm going to remind you of this. That's my job. That is every person with my skin tone's job every single time. And if you're not doing that, if you're not standing up every single time and using your voice every single time, then you're the problem.
Right. And do you think that will lead to permanent change? You think that's the thing that white people can do right now? Like you said you're speaking out and you're raising your boys differently. Do you think that would begin to make more permanent change?
I have to believe it does.
Mm,
The alternative is way too depressing.
mm,
I have to believe that that's the case. I have to believe that educating my little pale skinned boys about race at, from age 3 and up, and growing them in a visually diverse community of people, um, is going to make a difference. Because if I don't, Rochelle, I mean,
You're
where are we?
perpetuating it.
Yeah.
You'll be perpetuating it. Roy Love says, so true. We have to surround ourselves with people not like us. We can't see things that affect others if we're not around them. We must expand our bubbles. We must keep having these courageous conversations. Michelle, it's been a delight. We don't know where these conversations will take us about DEI and white fragility. We do know that we are here to help and share and speak out. This has been another epic moment, and there are more to come. Michelle, it's been a pleasure and such a delight to have you.
Thank you so much, Rochelle. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.